1 year ago, Darktide released to some pretty intense negative feedback from the gaming community. Most people agreed that the gameplay and art was fantastic, but pretty much everything outside of that was either broken or frustrating to interact with. The dismal technical state of the game, the fact that they released without a full crafting system, only having 4 classes, a predatory microtransaction shop, and the game trying to artificially inflate your playtime around every corner, amongst other things, left a sour taste in the community's mouth. Some even saying it should have been released as early access, and I don't entirely disagree with that. Many of us agreed to wait out the storm and come back to the game a year later, hoping Fat Shark would have improved the game vastly by then. And, well, here we are. 1 year has passed and the game received 14 patches, so is now the time to come back? The short answer is probably. It kind of depends what you put the game down for. The long answer is, well, the rest of the video. So let's get this thing started. This is Darktide after 1 year of development. To really understand what the devs did right over the last year, we gotta understand the main pain points the game had on release. And the first and foremost of those problems was the technical problems. Disconnecting every other game, optimization that made a 3080 look like a 10-year-old GPU, Poxhounds ascending the stairway to heaven. If you played the game on release, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This was probably the #1 complaint from the community, is that the game just felt broken. And honestly, I think that's the strongest argument for saying that the game should have been released in early access, because really the technical state made it feel like an early access game. And there were other reasons for that, like lack of content, but I think technical reasons was one of the biggest. Well, in this last month of playing, I haven't DC'd from a lobby a single time. So the disconnecting issue seems to be actually fixed. As far as performance goes, it seems to be much more stable. My 3080 runs the game between 40 and 60 FPS at 1440p with ray tracing off and high settings. This is better than before, as I remember dropping down to like 20 FPS in intense moments. So it's not perfect, right? Like ideally I could be able to run it at 60 FPS because most games, even games that came out after Darktide and look just as good as Darktide, run at 60 FPS on my machine. You got to consider how many enemies the AI is controlling, the insane amount of ragdolling that's possible, and of course you have to render the great looking maps and the fog effects. You know, I will say that's passable. A friend of mine is able to run the game just fine with a 1070 Ti. That should give you a pretty good idea where the performance is. As for bugs, those are a bit harder to identify as an individual player, but I haven't noticed any game-breaking bugs. There are some that patch 13 brought, but I would say it's a less buggy experience than it was on release. Now, it's not like a completely bug-free game and the performance could always be better, so it's not perfect, but it is definitely improved a lot since release. I couldn't believe it at the time, but Darktide released without a full crafting system. And of course, we eventually got this crafting system, and it's okay. I don't think it's bad per se, it's just that it feels like limiting the amount of times you can change the stats or blessings on a weapon is just an attempt to inflate your playtime, with there being so much RNG involved in getting the weapon you want. So you have the initial roll of the weapon, either from a shop or a mission reward, where you hope that the damage stat and other relevant stats are high enough for it to be usable, because when you upgrade the weapon, these stats don't change. And every time you do upgrade the weapon, the blessings and perks are completely RNG. Now, this wouldn't be as much of a problem if you could change the perks and blessings more than twice altogether. And I think the interesting part of this is that they make respeccing your talent tree completely free and easy to do. I think they understand that trying out different builds is a big part of the game. There have been times where I felt like Vermintide was just a build testing simulator. You go into a match, you see how the build did, and you go back to the drawing table. This is how a lot of in-game players played Tide games. And putting a limit on that just makes the process unbearable at times. Oh, you want to try a crit build on your one well-rolled surge staff? Well, that sucks because even if you haven't already adjusted the perks, you won't be able to change them back in case you don't like the build. So now you gotta go back to the RNG machine and you gotta hope you can roll a decent staff, and then you gotta upgrade it a few times to see if you get the right perks and blessings, and you just have to do this until you get what you want. I don't think that's a fun gameplay loop in any shape or form. It feels like it's just there to inflate your playtime. I dream of the day that they remove this and add customizable sights, scopes, attachments, barrels, yes, like Call of Duty. That's such a weird game to compare it to. There are many games with that style of crafting that are fantastic. I would say that the crafting system is good if they did those things, but for now, it's okay. My biggest gripe with the game on release was the mission terminal and the lack of solo play. My plan was to play through all the missions solo first, taking the game slow, taking in the scenery and the atmosphere that Fat Shark are so good at creating. Like, they put a lot of detail into these maps, the sound design and the spectacle around every corner. And in a pub, you can't really play the game slow and take all this in. One of the game's core mechanics wants you to stay closely knit with your team, and most teams want to run through the level. And unfortunately, there is still no solo mode in Darktide. But you can at least have private games with 2 or more people, I guess? This feels like a really weird decision to me. I don't know if this is tied to their decision to use dedicated servers or something like that, but I feel like in Horde games, it's almost a necessity to have a solo mode. Like, yeah, the game is made to be played co-op, but a big part of the Tide game specifically is the atmosphere, the world building. Fat Shark is praised over and over again for bringing fictional worlds to life with their map design, their character design, their dialogue. I mean, have you seen how good some of these maps look? It's insane to me that there's no solo play, but there is a mod for it, and we'll talk more about mods here in a second. And the mission terminal was a big problem because you couldn't just select the mission you want to play and what difficulty, and you still can't do this. They have improved it a bit though. They've added more missions to the terminal at any given time, and they've added a whole different level to the mission terminal. So you're more likely able to play the mission you want to, although I would say the chances of it being the mission you want to play and the difficulty you want to play is still relatively low, but it's a little bit better than it was before. And this is another thing where I really don't know why they won't let you just select a mission, but to me, being able to choose what mission you want to play and what difficulty feels like the basic necessity of user experience. And unfortunately, we still can't do this. So then let's talk about mods. Now, modding communities have been around fixing their favorite games for decades now. Those of you that played Skyrim, which is probably most of you, know exactly what I'm talking about. Fat Shark does now allow mods for Darktide, and that allowed the small but dedicated modding community for Vermintide to just move over to Darktide, which is just awesome. So yeah, you can finally have your scoreboard, your third person, your mission terminal hotkey, and a bunch of other things. If you haven't taken the time to check out Darktide on Nexus mods, I would highly encourage you to do so, as the game feels much worse without mods now. It's not too hard to set them up, and it improves the game vastly, to the point where I can't play the game without mods now. If I see that my mods haven't loaded, I instantly exit out the game and see what's wrong. Now, when Darktide released, we only had 4 classes, and the build diversity for those classes wasn't the greatest. And I will say, this is where Fat Shark has improved the game the most. Patch 13 came out not too long ago, and it has completely refreshed the game for me. That patch brought us triple the amount of ults, auras, and blitz abilities, which in turn increased the build diversity by like tenfold. They completely scrapped Vermintide's approach to talents and gave us more of a skill tree. So for the most part, you have 4 or 5 viable builds for each character. I mean, you want to play a much larger Ironbreaker? You could do that now. You want to play the shooty sci-fi version of the Mercenary? That's a thing too. And a lot of the ults feel similar if you've played Vermintide, but there are some originals in there like the Psyker's Scryer's Gaze. And of course, blitz abilities bring something entirely new to the builds table. So you have a good amount of theory crafting to do now. It's all about what blitz ability can I mix with what ult, and what keystone complements that the best. So you genuinely have a lot of build decisions to make in this game. And as I said before, Tide games can kind of feel like build testing simulators, and that's why someone like me loves the game so much. I love theory crafting builds, and they have enabled us to do this with patch 13. So yeah, they added a ton of build diversity, which the game lacked at launch. This alone may be worth coming back to the game to at least check it out. The amount of rewards you got on release for playing the higher difficulties was pretty low, and really it didn't feel like the game rewarded you much for completing a mission at all, to the point where many of us burnt out on the game super early because there was just nothing to it but the gameplay, myself included. Thankfully, this has changed. The difference in rewards is actually felt now on the higher difficulties, and they added a whole nother level to the mission terminal. There is now the standard level and the Auric level, and this is another one of my favorite changes they've done. Each one of the missions on the Auric level has 2 special conditions to the level, so high intensity shock troop gauntlet, high intensity hunt grounds, high intensity ventilation purge, you get the idea. Doing one of these Auric damnation missions gets you about 10,000 more Ordo dockets than a normal damnation mission with a special condition. And further, they added Maelstrom missions, which are absolutely insane. These have their own unique modifiers that make them play differently than other missions. One of my favorites is one that sends waves of mutants running you down like a cavalry of Hulks. Another one makes it so you only fight the Scab faction, which I think is interesting. You could take a different build for that kind of mission. And these Maelstrom missions have the highest rewards in the game. And in many cases, they're the most difficult missions, so that's just appropriate. I love that the game has something that now feels like a genuine challenge. While on standard level missions, you'll find knife zealots running across the map, just soloing everything, while you have a nice slow walk through Tertium. On Maelstrom, you really do have to work together, and if your name's not JSAT or Choco B, then you will probably find yourself challenged on these. These Auric Maelstrom missions feel like in-game content, something to work towards. And thanks to these missions, my nightmares will forever be haunted by... Now, the gameplay was never something the game struggled with. I think most of us agreed that the combat is excellent, even on release. They took everything they built with Vermintide, added gunplay, new enemy designs, and doubled down on how visceral the gore and ragdolling is. But they've added improvements here. Mutants no longer whip around corners, and you can now push poxbursters more reliably. Dogs are actually now functional, and you can reliably dodge them. They've added a few balance passes that made some of the weapons that struggled into murdering machines. The slab shield is now one of the Ogryn's best weapons, if not the best. They implemented a lot of small changes that makes the gunplay a bit smoother and more enjoyable than it was before. And that applies to more than just the gameplay, it applies to the game as a whole. While there are certainly still problems with the game, a bunch of small changes accumulated to make the game feel quite good to play nowadays. I don't find myself frustrated every 10 minutes by some weird quirk of the game like I did on launch. I can now spend ungodly amounts of times testing builds, seeing how it does in game, and going back to the drawing board. I don't have to run all the way to the mission terminal every time I want to queue for a game. And playing the hardest difficulty actually feels rewarding and challenging. While there's still no story and the crafting rubs me the wrong way, I feel the game is actually in a pretty good spot. So my answer to whether or not the game is worth coming back to for the most part is yes. If you put the game down because of the technical state, the lack of crafting, in-game content, and playstyle diversity, then now is a great time to boot up the game again. And that will do it for this video. The next content I'm planning is a series of Ogryn guides, so be on the lookout for that. I appreciate you guys spending your time watching, listening to me talk about Darktide. If you liked the video, please subscribe, like the video, and I will see you on the next one.